it's not enough just to pick a jury. You've got to instruct the jury so they know what to do when they go into jury deliberation. No jury goes into jury deliberation without first knowing what the rules of evidence are, and they get these instructions from a judge. So the next step in being ready to convincingly communicate the truth of the gospel is for us to be able to instruct your jury evidentially. Let me give you a few things to think about as you're instructing your jury. One of these is really important, right? And it's simply this. The fact that the other side can make a case doesn't mean that the case is true. I see this all the time in juries, right? I get up there and we spend 4 weeks making a case on the prosecution side, and then at the end of that, the defense attorney doesn't stand up and say, I give up. He actually makes a case himself for 4 or 5 weeks. And I've done this at times where our case took 3 or 4 weeks, their case takes 3 or 4 weeks, and before we even get very much further, the suspect confessed. So after this compelling defensive case was presented for 3 or 4 weeks, it turns out that he was guilty all along, and he actually confesses to it. So the fact that they can make a case does not mean the case is true. And by the way, you're probably going to see some of this even from people who are making a case against Christianity. Sometimes that case can be very robust, right? It can be very entertaining. It can be winsome. It can be provocative. It can be visually persuasive. All of that does not mean it's true. Of course, the same could be said for us. It's important for us to be able to work through the evidence and don't assume that just because they're able to make a case, the case is true. I think sometimes young people are shocked to find that someone is making a case against what they believe, either in the university or online. And just the mere fact the case is being made is enough to shake them. But remember, you can make a case and it can still be wrong. Another thing that's important to remember about the nature of evidence is something that I deal with at every criminal trial, at every crime scene. Usually I get there and there's these kinds of markers, these placards, that are at the scene because somebody has identified something they think is of evidential value and they will mark it in some way. I'll put this here for that one. Now, the question is, what counts? When I walk in a crime scene, I'm not quite sure what is an artifact or what is evidence. I rope in everything with that crime tape. Why? Because everything has the potential to be evidence. Well, really? You mean the stuff that's in the crime scene has? Yeah, that counts. That has the potential to be evidence. But the stuff that's missing from the crime scene also has the potential to be evidence. Well, how about like things the suspect says? Yeah, that counts as evidence. Well, how about the stuff he could have said but didn't say? Well, that has evidential value too. How about some of his behaviors? Yeah, the way he behaved at a certain point that has evidential value. Well, what about the things he could have done but didn't do? Yep, you're starting to get the point. It's everything that's there, everything that's missing, everything has evidential value. And I keep this in mind as I read through Scripture, right? Because there's always a temptation just to read past everything. And you think, well, this part's not important. This has no evidential value. The genealogies in the beginning they're long, those genealogies in the beginning of some of those Gospels. That doesn't really have any evidential value, does it? Oh, don't be so sure. Depending on the kind of case you're making, you'll return to every word of Scripture in order to make the case for what it is you want to make the case for. Everything has the potential to be evidence. And that brings me to another point that we make when we talk about instruct people about the nature of evidence. Whoever makes the claim, that's the person who has the burden of proof with this evidence. Now, sometimes this kind of sounds this way when people are challenging us. Look, Jim, you believe there's a God that's invisible that I don't see. Therefore, if you believe this God exists, the burden of proof is on you to demonstrate that this God exists. As an atheist, I don't have to make that claim. I don't claim there is a God. I don't have to make that case. That burden of proof's not on me, it's on you. Okay, that isn't really the way that crime scenes work, though. When we get to a crime scene, we ask ourselves the question, I've got to get a cause in mind. What suspect is the cause of these 3 pieces of evidence? And I might offer a suspect A. My partner might come in the room and say, no, I think it's suspect B. That's the guy who actually caused those 3 pieces of evidence. Okay, the burden of proof is on me to demonstrate why I think suspect A is the best explanation for this evidence. The burden of proof is on him to explain why he thinks suspect B is the best explanation for this evidence. In the end, whoever is trying to explain what caused it has a burden of proof. Now, if I'm looking as a theist at the universe and I'm suggesting that there is evidence in the universe that has to be explained, okay, well, I think it's God. I think God's the explanation. Well, the burden of proof is on me to show why I think God is the best explanation for that evidence in the universe. But guess what? If my partner, who's an atheist, says, no, I think that physics and chemistry and space, time, and matter alone can account for that evidence, Okay, that's also a claim. The burden of proof is on him to demonstrate why he thinks his natural cause is the best explanation. Here's my point. As it turns out, both of us have a burden of proof. It's not just on me as the theist, because the burden of proof is on explaining why my cause best accounts for the evidence in the scene. Another important truth about evidence. Possibilities don't really matter. The standard of proof in criminal trials is not beyond a possible doubt. If it was, we would never convict anybody. It's beyond a reasonable doubt, because I can always raise a possible doubt that could derail you. So our jurors are instructed, don't get derailed by possible doubts. Reasonable doubts are those that are grounded firmly in inferences from evidence, okay? So if you think you've got possible doubts about something in Scripture, I do too. I have tons of possible doubts. They don't stop me from being very certain of my beliefs, because the standard of proof is not beyond a possible doubt. It's beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm not even sure if tomorrow when I start my car it won't explode, okay? It's possible. But because it's not reasonable, I still start my car. We all do this because our standard of proof is reasonable, not possible. The same is true when it comes to theistic beliefs, beliefs about God, about Christianity, and in crime scenes. Another important piece of information about evidence, the nature of evidence. The more cumulative your case is, the better it is, the more reasonable the inference. The more information I have, the more evidence I have that points to the same reasonable inference, the better the inference. We've drawn this out in forensic faith, also in cold case Christianity, a cumulative case for why we think this particular suspect is guilty of a crime. It's stronger the more pieces I can surround the suspect with. This is the nature of cumulative cases. And what's great about cumulative cases is it can help us to figure out what to do with confusing pieces of evidence. What if I have 10 pieces of evidence that point most reasonably to a particular conclusion, and then an 11th piece of evidence that doesn't seem to be as dramatic, doesn't seem to be as certain? I'm not quite sure how even to interpret the 11th piece of evidence. Well, really? Well, you know how to interpret it because you allow the 10 certain pieces of evidence to interpret how you read the 11th piece. This is also true at crime scenes. We do the same thing. I've got 3 things that point to one guy, one thing that's kind of neutral. Well, okay, my conclusion is still good based on the certainty of these 3 things. The same thing happens in Scripture too. I might have a belief that I hold theologically, and I find 10 pieces of Scripture that support this belief. But I found an 11th piece of Scripture, and it's kind of troubling. I'm not quite sure how to interpret it. It seems much more malleable. Well, you know how to read it now based on the 10 you can read with certainty. Allow the 10 to speak into the 1 rather than the 1 to speak into the 10. That's how we always assess evidence. And what's great about cumulative cases is that cumulative cases will also give you, they'll give you certainty about your conclusions, but they will help you to interpret outlying pieces of evidence that could be confusing. Let me give you one last thing. Witnesses, you're told as a juror, you are to treat witnesses as reliable unless you can demonstrate why you shouldn't treat them as reliable. We have a template for measuring witnesses in jury trials. Hey, were they really there to see what they said they saw? Do they change their story over time? Can they be corroborated in some way? Do they hold some bias that would cause them to lie? Well, guess what? If all those things check, you're to trust that witness. Oh, I don't know. The way that she talked, she kind of didn't speak very clearly, and I think she was kind of squinting a lot. Really? Can you check the boxes in those 4 areas? Yes. Well, then you're to trust her. I don't care what she looks like, sounds like. That doesn't matter. What matters is, does she check the boxes? Because guess what? Witnesses can be troubling at times. Here's what I mean. Keep this in mind. Witnesses seldom ever agree. They can see the same thing. They can come in and see this crime today, but if I interview them tonight, they'll have slightly different stories. And it's not because they're lying to me or they're unreliable. They just have a personal background which causes them to focus on certain things differently. So they'll see something differently. Maybe they won't even see what it is that this one saw. This person sees things and notices things that this one person didn't. I then puzzle these things back together. When I first read through the Gospels and I saw there were variations between the Gospels, it didn't give me any pause for concern because I knew what reliable eyewitness accounts looked like. And they looked just like that. Also, sometimes a witness will raise a question and you're thinking to yourself as you're talking to that witness, really? How could that be true? And then the second witness comes along a week later and gives you additional information, and now suddenly this makes sense. This makes sense given what the second witness said. This happens in Scripture all the time. I'll give you an example of this. Caiaphas has got Jesus in front of him at the trial, and they're challenging the deity of Jesus and how special he thinks he is. We'll tell you what, prophesy for us then. Show us how prophetic you are. And they slap him in the face and they say, tell us, who struck you? Well, in that gospel account, if you read it, you're thinking to yourself, well, how hard would that be? You're standing right in front of me. If you're standing right in front of me, I can just look at you and say, hey, you slapped me. I mean, you're standing right in front of me. Because it's not until you get to the other account that you realize that Jesus, at the beginning of this, was blindfolded. This reporter didn't mention that. And it was confusing to me when I first read it. But now it's clear, the same way in all of my cases, unintentional eyewitness support always is the earmark, it's the hallmark of reliable eyewitness testimony, and I see it in Scripture all the time. Let me add one last thing about this. There are times when witnesses are actually incorrect. It doesn't mean you're to treat them as unreliable. There are times when a witness will get a detail wrong, and we'll have to explain to the jury why it is so that witness got a detail. I had one case where the woman ran in, and when she found the victim's body, she couldn't recall the next two things she did, and she got them wrong. But she had a reason to get them wrong. She was so traumatized by what she discovered. Well, it turns out everything else she described was spot on, and the jurors actually found her to be a reliable witness. Now, I'm not suggesting there's anything incorrect in Scripture. They're reliable. But even if there was, you'd still be instructed to consider them reliable if you can explain what's incorrect and why is it incorrect. This is my point. You're stuck with a reliable account even if there were errors, and there aren't any. So the bar is a lot higher. We actually jumped that bar without any problem in Scripture. And once you know these different principles of evidence and the nature of evidence, it makes it a lot easier to take the time. Because once you know you don't have to have two witnesses that agree word for word about everything, the pressure's off, isn't it? Understand the rules of evidence so you can communicate them to your friends and your family before you even begin to make the case for what you believe. That's the way to hold and share a forensic faith.